In Chapter 6, and particularly in the 6.1 subsection, we're going to be talking about unemployment. Now, you would think unemployment would be pretty easy to define. You don't have a job, but that can't be the real definition. I presume a lot of grandparents don't have jobs, but we don't think of grandparents as unemployed. Bet there's a lot of 5-year-olds who don't have jobs. We don't consider them to be unemployed. So obviously you can't just add up all the people who don't have a job and thereby know what the unemployment rate is. You have to have some criteria for distinguishing between children, people who are in school and aren't looking for a job, mothers who are taking care of small children and don't want a job, elderly people who are retired and don't want a job. How do you get those people who are not working subtracted out of the labor force? Well, that's how basically we define the labor force in a particular way. So let's go ahead and jump into our slide and figure out how we do this. So first of all, we take the total population, and then out of the entire population, we subtract out people who are quote unquote not in the labor force, which then leaves us with this is the labor force. So what's the definition of the labor force? So the labor force are all the people who are age 16 and over who are either employed or actively seeking work. So the labor force are the working people 16 years and older and those who would like to be working. And how do we know they want to be working? Well, they're actively seeking work. That is the government's definition. So it turns out that there's going to be some complications in measuring these things. So those people who are not employed and are not actively seeking for work are not considered even part of the labor force. They're part of the population, but they're retired, they're homemakers, they're students, they're whatever, and we don't consider them to be unemployed. So let's take a look at the size of the labor force. The labor force comprises about half the population. So out of our total population in the US, half are in the labor force and half are not in the labor force. Now, the size of the labor force has more than doubled since 1960, mostly due to population growth, but also due to labor force participation rates. This is a fancy way of saying, out of the total population, what percentage of the total population wants to be in the labor force. As you all know, there's been a huge cultural change in the United States since the 1960s, and a large number of women who weren't in the labor force before 1960 have now joined the labor force. I see just by looking at the list of students in our class, over half of the students are women. So clearly women have changed their cultural attitude toward work and are now seriously in the labor force today, but were not in the labor force back in the 1950s. So let's take a look at what labor force growth does. Here we're looking at a production possibilities frontier or curve. And the dotted one, or the dashed one rather, is the one that exists now. And then you notice there's a solid one farther out. So taking a look at here, here's our original one, and here is the new one. Remember, anytime you're moving from one curve to a farther out curve, that means we can produce more of both goods at the same time. Now, what's pushing this curve farther out? In this particular case, it's the fact that labor force has grown. Obviously, with more workers, more things can be done than in a country with fewer workers. That should be basic common sense. So having more workers pushes out the production possibilities frontier, making it possible to do more things than we could do before. Now the labor force is growing due to population growth and immigration. Immigration causing the population growth, because there's two ways to get population growth. You can either have a lot more children, you can reduce the death rate, or you can have immigration coming into your country. Any of those factors will increase the total number of people who are possible to be in the labor force. Now, death rates have declined quite dramatically in the past, and at this point, the decline in death rates is getting smaller and smaller, so that's not a major contributor to growth. Having lots of children is also no longer a major contributor to population growth, because most families nowadays have fewer, in the United States, have fewer than 2 children per woman. It takes 2.1 children per woman on average just to maintain a constant population. If you fall below 2.1, your population will decline. So the US has an increasing population, mostly due to adding new new immigrants to the United States. We add about 2 million new workers yearly, and now remember, part of those will be children born in the U.S. as American citizens, and so they'll be adding, as they grow up, they'll be added to the labor force, and immigrants as well. And we've already mentioned the production possibility curve pushes outward, making it possible to produce more goods and services. Now, the economy needs to create about 2 million new jobs every year for the expanding labor force. If you obviously add 2 million more people to the workforce, then you need to have 2 million more jobs for those people to do. Otherwise, you'll end up at a point like F. You notice on our curve, F is inside the new production possibilities curve of where we could be. And that's taking place because if you don't have enough jobs, those extra workers will not be productive like they could be if they had a job, and therefore we're not reaching our full productive capacity. Unemployment now. If we end up inside the production possibilities curve, as we pointed out, we're not producing at capacity. So unemployment is the inability of a labor force participant to find a job. So this means we have idled resources. We have resources that are perfectly productive, but in fact cannot find a place for themselves to be productive because they can't find a job. So anytime you have unemployment, you are operating inside your production possibilities curve. And we have a famous economist from the United States, Professor Okun. Okun has a quote-unquote a law, and Okun's law suggests that a 1% increase in unemployment results in a 3% decrease in GDP, although newer numbers show that a 1% increase reduces total GDP by somewhere between 1 and 2%. So the ratio of decline in GDP to increase in unemployment has been declining over the last several years. But it still is a number that's positive. I mean, it's no doubt. If you have an increase in unemployment, then your ability to produce GDP goes down. Now let's talk about measuring unemployment. How are we going to do this? Well, we measure unemployment by calculating something called the unemployment rate. Now, to have an unemployment rate, you have to know who's unemployed. So we are defining unemployment. A person is unemployed if he or she is not working but is currently actively seeking work. The two have to go together. If you stop looking for work, you're treated no differently than a retired person, right? We don't treat them as unemployed. So when you stop looking for work, then by definition, you're no longer unemployed, even if you don't have a job. We'll pick this up on another slide. But right now, let's do the math. The unemployment rate will be the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. So back in 2019, there were 6 million people unemployed. There was 163 million in the labor force, which is about half the population of around 330 million people. So that meant 3.7% of the labor force was unemployed at that particular time. 3.7% is a relatively low unemployment rate by historical standards. Now, the unemployment rate is higher for different groups. It's higher for men than women, so women have a lower unemployment rate than men. Blacks and Hispanics have a higher unemployment rate than whites do, and whites and Hispanics have roughly the same unemployment rate. Less educated people have a higher unemployment rate than more highly educated people. And this fact contributes to the previous fact. Blacks and Hispanics in the United States, on average, have less education than whites or Asians, and so therefore have a higher unemployment rate. So what's really driving this is not the ethnicity itself. What's usually driving it is the level of education and therefore the skills that go along with that education. It's way easier for educated people to find jobs than for uneducated people. Teenagers generally have a much higher unemployment rate than older people do. Next issue, the duration of unemployment. The severity of unemployment depends on how long the spell of joblessness lasts. That should be a pretty obvious statement. Does everybody agree if you get laid off and find a job within a week, you're in a totally different situation than if you're laid off and can't find a job for a year? Obviously, the unemployment to one person is going to be way, way worse than what it is to the other person. So the longer the duration of unemployment, the more pain the unemployment causes. So if we can have a world in which duration of unemployment is relatively short, then the pain of unemployment is relatively mild. If we have an economy where the duration of unemployment is long, then of course we have a very painful form of unemployment. Generally speaking, when the economy stagnates or goes into decline, you would expect that both the unemployment rate would rise because it's harder to find a job, and the duration will increase because it's going to be harder to find a job once you get laid off. Now, let's look at some reasons why someone might be unemployed. The largest reason, is highlighted in yellow here, is you are a job loser, meaning someone has laid you off for some reason. That's 46% of all the unemployed people are unemployed because they lost a job. Another group of people, as you see in a slightly yellow, but I guess a darker yellow, are called job leavers. These are people who quit their job for whatever reason. You're not happy with your boss, you're not happy living in Georgia, decide to move to Tennessee or whatever. When you quit your job and go move to Tennessee, you're not going to be instantly employed. So during that time period you're looking for a job, you would be considered unemployed because you're a job leaver. Another group of people are new entrants. Let's assume that you were a student in college, and let's think about your undergraduate degree, and you weren't working, and so springtime rolls around, you graduate, you don't have a job the day you graduate, you might have to look for a job all summer. During that summertime, while you're looking for a job, you are a new entrant, unemployed person. And then last but not least, we have re-entrants. This could easily describe an MBA student. Let's pick in our mind, just for an example, you are, well, obviously if you're an MBA, you graduated from college, you went to work, so you were employed. You chose to leave the labor force by no longer, when you went to college, to graduate school, you quit your job, left the labor force, you're not considered unemployed anymore because you're not even looking for a job. You do your MBA, then you go back out into the work world. You are now called a re-entrant. You're not a new entrant, you're a re-entrant because you've worked before. So, as you might suspect, new entrants are generally quite young. These are folks just starting out in their first job, for the first job that they're ever going to have, whereas re-entrants have already had jobs before. They left the workforce for some reason, and now they're re-entering back into the workforce. Classic example I already went through is MBA. It could easily happen for a new mother who chooses to take several years off with a small child and then re-enters the workforce. It could be a retired person who retires at 55 and then finds out by the time they're 60, they're tired of playing golf and say, I got to do something again. I can't stand this being unemployed. Not unemployed, can't stand this being retired. They're not unemployed because they're not in the labor force. And then they decide to go back to work, so they start looking for a job. Then they are now considered unemployed as a re-entrant. So we can come on and I'm going to give every single possibility. Just want you to recognize what a re-entrant is. Okay, well, this is bullet points that were on the previous slide. I'm sorry, I went through them relatively quickly. They were all just putting in print what I just said in words. Now let's talk about some difficulties with measuring unemployment. One of these is called the discouraged worker effect. Remember how we've already defined unemployment is you have to be without a job, but you have to actively be looking for work. Because if you're not actively looking for work, we don't even consider you part of the labor force. You're a retired person or something. So the first thing to recognize is during very high time periods of unemployment, a laid off worker may have looked for a job for 6 months and then basically at that point gave up and said, until the economy gets better, there's no point looking for work. I'm not wasting my time anymore. As soon as they stop looking for work, what happens to the government statistics? The statisticians no longer count them. They treat them like they're a retired person. So here we have a problem. Our current method of measuring unemployment does not capture discouraged workers as unemployed people. It treats them as if they're no longer even in the labor force. So the measured unemployment rate is going to undercount unemployment due to the discouraged worker effect. Now, here's another problem. This is referred to as underemployment. How about if you're a worker who's either working part-time or working in a job that's beneath your skills? And the reason that's happening is, let's say you've moved to a new area and you needed some money quickly, so you took the first job that you could find, even though it really wasn't the job you truly wanted. And you're going to work in it for a few months till you build up enough cash, then go start looking for, quote unquote, a real job or the job that you're really qualified for. During that time period that you're working under your ability, the government will treat you as if you're employed because technically you are working. So the statistics do not measure how underemployed you are. They treat every single person who has a job, even if you're an engineer working at McDonald's flipping hamburgers, you're considered employed, even though you're not employed using your full skills. Now, how big a problem is this? For engineers, it's not a very big problem. It's hard to imagine most engineers who lost a job working at McDonald's, right? Now, they could be still underemployed by going from being a senior design engineer to a basic engineer. I mean, that's possible that you had to take a job beneath your skill level or whatever. But right now, the government statistics don't measure that. They simply treat all workers who are working for pay as employed, no matter how beneath their skill level the job is. Now, in this particular slide, we're going to count something that goes in the opposite direction. It's called phantom unemployed. I don't think that's a particularly good name for it, but what this means is somebody gets counted as unemployed, but really isn't unemployed. Let's think of someone who could be like that. Let's assume that somebody is trying to figure out a way not to have to work and they want to get on the unemployment rolls, or they want to be on a disability, okay? But they're not really disabled. They're faking it. Okay, that's the interesting question. So now what do we do with a person like that? They're counted as unemployed because they don't have a job. They claim they're looking for work, but they're not really looking for work. They turn down every job they get. So what they really want is to collect the unemployment insurance. Those workers are still counted as unemployed, even though they really aren't trying to find a job. So we have the discouraged worker effect says the government statistics are undercounting the unemployed number, and the phantom unemployed says we're overcounting the true unemployment rate. Where these two numbers line up is very difficult to figure out, because it's very difficult to know when you have a true discouraged worker and when you have a phantomly unemployed worker, since obviously they're not going to tell you, so it's really difficult for a statistician to measure them. And then last but not least, in this particular set of slides, what are the human costs of unemployment? Well, it turns out to be quite serious. Not only is there a loss of income, that's the most obvious thing about not having a job, but more important, not more importantly, but certainly important, is the issue of lack of confidence, social stress, and lost lives. Let's go ahead and mention a couple of those things. We tend to base a large part of our sense of, our social standing in life a lot of it is based on our jobs. And when you don't have a job, you feel like a loser. It's really hard not to, even though you are still the exact same person you were when you had the job. And even if it's not your fault, if we're in the middle of a huge recession and you get laid off through no fault of your own, think of construction workers during the 2008 real estate crisis when the entire economy melted down. Well, half the construction workers in America got laid off. It wasn't their fault. No one was building houses. So clearly it's not them that's the bad person. But how do they feel about themselves when they're not working? Well, for most of us, like I said, it's a devastating psychological effect. The social stress, of course, goes along with that. When you feel bad about yourself, you tend to act out. What kind of acting out do you do? It turns out if you look at the statistics, alcoholism rises during period, and other drug abuse as well, rises among unemployed people. All kinds of things like spousal violence, spousal abuse goes up, divorce rate goes up. So when we talk, also the death rate goes up. People commit suicide at a higher rate, or because of these other things they're doing, like drinking and things like that, it causes a lot of healthcare problems that leads to early death. So it turns out that the human cost of unemployment is quite large, so we want to have as low an unemployment rate as we possibly can. But we're going to find out as we get into later chapters, that number cannot end up going all the way to zero. There will be some amount of unemployment all the time for frictional and structural reasons that we'll talk about in a future set of slides. So for now, we're going to end it on this particular slide.